Sarah Chen, a professional photo restoration specialist in Chicago, had seen thousands of old family photographs cross her desk. But when 78-year-old Margaret Williams placed the faded 1931 photograph on her workbench that crisp October morning, something immediately caught her attention. The image showed a perfect family portrait, a well-dressed couple in their 30s standing behind three children arranged on the front steps of a modest two-story house in what appeared to be a small American town. My grandmother Rose kept this photograph on her mantelpiece for 60 years, Margaret explained, her weathered hands trembling slightly as she adjusted her glasses. After she passed last month, I was going through her belongings and found this tucked away in her jewelry box with a note that simply said, "Never forget. I thought you could clean it up for the family reunion next spring." Sarah positioned the photograph under her magnifying lamp, adjusting the light to examine the details more closely. The family looked prosperous despite the economic hardships of 1931. The father wore a crisp white shirt and suspenders, the mother a simple but elegant dress with a pearl necklace, and the three children were dressed in their Sunday best. The house behind them showed signs of careful maintenance, with freshly painted shutters and a well-tended garden visible at the edges of the frame. As Sarah began her preliminary examination, scanning the photograph for tears, stains, or areas that would need special attention, her trained eye caught something unusual in the upper right corner. Behind the family, partially obscured by the shadow of the house's eaves, was what appeared to be another face, pale, indistinct, but unmistakably human. The features were barely visible, almost ghostly in their transparency, but the outline of a person was definitely there. "Mrs. Williams," Sarah said carefully, "do you know who this might be?" She pointed to the mysterious figure with her pencil, being careful not to touch the delicate surface of the photograph. Margaret leaned forward, squinting at the spot where Sarah's pencil hovered. Her face went pale, and she sank back into the chair beside the workbench. I've looked at this photograph 1,000 times. I never noticed." Her voice trailed off as she stared at the faint outline that seemed to emerge more clearly under the bright restoration lamp. "Sometimes these old photographs contain details that aren't immediately visible to the naked eye," Sarah explained, gently. "Changes in lighting, aging of the photographic paper, or even the angle of viewing can reveal things that were always there but hidden. Do you have any family records that might tell us who was present when this was taken?" Margaret fumbled in her purse and withdrew a small leather-bound diary. "This was my grandmother's. She wrote in it almost every day from 1925 until she died. Maybe there's something." She flipped through the yellowed pages, her finger tracing the careful cursive handwriting. "Here, October 15th, 1931. Had the family portrait taken today. For Henry's birthday. The children looked so beautiful. Prayed that Robert would somehow be with us in spirit." Sarah made a note on her restoration form. "Who was Robert?" "My grandmother's youngest brother," Margaret replied, her voice growing softer. "He left home in 1929 when the stock market crashed. The family lost almost everything, their savings, my great-grandfather's business, even nearly lost the house. Robert blamed himself because he had convinced his father to invest in stocks that became worthless. He disappeared one night, leaving only a note saying he would make things right somehow." The morning light streaming through Sarah's studio windows cast long shadows across the old photograph, and the mysterious face seemed to become more pronounced. Sarah adjusted her magnifying glass and studied the figure more carefully. The facial features, though faint, showed the same strong jawline and high cheekbones visible in the other family members. The clothing appeared to be a dark coat or jacket, and there was something in the posture that suggested the person was trying to remain hidden while still being part of the family gathering. "Mrs. Williams, I think we need to do more than just restore this photograph," Sarah said thoughtfully. "There's a story here that your family needs to know." 3 days later, Sarah found herself in the dusty archives of the Chicago Historical Society, accompanied by Margaret Williams and her nephew David, a freelance journalist who had driven up from Springfield when Margaret called him about their discovery. The building's research room smelled of old paper and preservation chemicals, a familiar and comforting scent to Sarah, who often came here for her restoration work. Small-town newspapers from 1931 are surprisingly well preserved, explained Dr. Patricia Hoffman, the head archivist, as she wheeled a cart of bound newspaper volumes to their table. The economic hardships meant that many families kept newspapers longer than usual. They used them for insulation, wrapping paper, even wallpaper in some cases. We have the complete collection of the Millbrook County Gazette from that era. David opened the first volume, scanning the headlines from October 1931. The pages were filled with stories of bank closures, farm foreclosures, and families leaving for California in search of work. "Here," he said, pointing to a small article dated October 20th, 1931. "Local family reports missing son. Robert Henderson, 24, disappeared from the family home on Elm Street 5 days ago. Anyone with information should contact Sheriff Morrison. Margaret." Gasped. "Henderson? That was my grandmother's maiden name before she married my grandfather, Williams. This has to be about Uncle Robert." Sarah photographed the newspaper clipping with her digital camera, making sure to capture every detail. "Let's see if there are any follow-up articles." They spent the next 2 hours methodically going through each issue, finding several more mentions of Robert Henderson. The stories painted a picture of a young man struggling with guilt and depression after the family's financial losses. November 3rd, 1931. Search called off for missing Henderson boy. After 2 weeks of searching the surrounding countryside, Sheriff Morrison announced that the search for Robert Henderson has been suspended. "We've done everything we can," Morrison told reporters. "Sometimes people just don't want to be found." But then David found something unexpected in the December 15th, 1931 edition. Buried in the back pages was a small article. "Anonymous donation saves Henderson farm. An unknown benefactor has paid off the mortgage on the Henderson family farm on Elm Street, allowing the family to keep their home through the winter." "It's a Christmas miracle," said Patriarch Henry Henderson. The three researchers looked at each other across the table. "Someone was helping the family," Sarah observed. "Someone who didn't want to be identified." The next morning, Sarah received an unexpected phone call at her studio. "Miss Chen, this is Father Timothy Mackenzie from St. Mary's Catholic Church in Millbrook. Margaret Williams contacted me yesterday about a photograph and some family history research. I think I might have some information that could help you." Within an hour, Sarah and Margaret were driving through the Illinois countryside toward Millbrook, a town of barely 3,000 people nestled among rolling farmland. The November weather had turned cold, and the bare trees lined the country roads like skeletal fingers against the gray sky. Margaret sat quietly in the passenger seat, clutching her grandmother's diary and staring out at the landscape that her family had called home for 3 generations. St. Mary's Church stood at the center of town, a modest brick building with a tall spire that could be seen from miles away. Father Mackenzie, a man in his 70s with kind eyes and silver hair, met them at the door. "I've been the pastor here for 42 years, he explained as he led them into his office. "When I arrived in 1982, the previous priest, Father O'Sullivan, was still alive. He told me stories about the Depression years that I never forgot. The priest's office was filled with boxes of church records, baptismal certificates, marriage licenses, and death certificates dating back to the 1800s. Father O'Sullivan specifically mentioned the Henderson family and a young man named Robert, who used to attend Mass regularly until he disappeared in 1929. But here's what might interest you. Father O'Sullivan said that Robert didn't actually disappear. He said the young man stayed in town, living in secret, doing odd jobs at night to earn money that he would anonymously send to his family." Sarah felt her pulse quicken. "Did Father O'Sullivan ever see Robert during this time?" According to his notes, yes. Robert would sometimes come to the church late at night to pray. He was consumed with guilt about his family's losses and refused to return home until he could somehow make amends. Father Mackenzie opened an old wooden box and withdrew a yellowed envelope. "Father O'Sullivan kept this. It's a letter Robert wrote to him in early 1932, explaining his situation and asking for the priest's blessing to leave town permanently." Margaret's hands shook as she accepted the letter. The handwriting was careful and precise. Dear Father O'Sullivan, I have managed to save enough money to pay off my family's debts, but I cannot face them knowing the pain I caused. I will always love them, but I must start a new life where my mistakes cannot hurt them anymore. Please pray for me. Robert Henderson. So he was there, Sarah whispered, thinking of the mysterious figure in the photograph. He was watching his family, protecting them, but couldn't bring himself to join them. Armed with Father Mackenzie's information, Sarah and Margaret spent the afternoon exploring Millbrook, trying to piece together Robert Henderson's secret life during those crucial months in 1931 and 1932. Their first stop was the town's small, historical museum, housed in a converted grain elevator on Main Street. The elderly volunteer curator, Mrs. Eleanor Walsh, had lived in Millbrook her entire life and remembered stories her parents told about the Depression years. Oh my, yes, I remember hearing about the mystery benefactor, Mrs. Walsh said as she showed them through displays of artifacts from the 1930s. There were several families that received anonymous help during those years, money left on doorsteps, groceries appearing on back porches, firewood stacked quietly during the night. People called it the work of an angel, but my father always suspected it was someone local who had managed to find work when others couldn't. She led them to a display case containing photographs of the town during the Depression. Look at this one. It's the old railroad depot from 1931. In the black and white photograph, Sarah could see a group of men standing beside a freight train. The railroad was one of the few businesses that kept hiring during those years. They needed workers to load and unload cargo, especially at night when the freight trains came through. Margaret studied the photograph closely. Could Robert have been working for the railroad? It's very possible, Mrs. Walsh replied. Night work paid better, and it would explain how someone could earn money while staying out of sight during the day. The railroad kept employment records, but they're stored at the county courthouse now. Their next destination was the courthouse, an imposing limestone building that had served Millbrook County since 1898. The clerk's office was closing soon, but the deputy clerk, a middle-aged woman named Linda Morrison, agreed to help them search the employment records when she learned about their research. Morrison, any relation to the sheriff mentioned in the newspaper? Sarah asked. My grandfather, Linda replied with a smile. He used to tell stories about that missing Henderson boy. Said he never believed Robert had really left town. Kept finding evidence that someone was living rough in the old abandoned buildings near the railroad tracks. After an hour of searching through dusty file boxes, Linda found what they were looking for: Chicago and Northwestern Railroad employment records for 1931-1932. There, listed among the night shift workers, was R. Hansen, hired October 1931, terminated March 1932. The address listed was simply transient worker, railroad housing. Hansen, Margaret murmured. That's close enough to Henderson that it could be an assumed name. And look at the dates, Sarah pointed out. He started working just days after he supposedly disappeared, and he quit right around the time Father O'Sullivan said he left town permanently. Back at Sarah's studio the following week, she had set up specialized equipment to examine the 1931 photograph more thoroughly. Using digital enhancement techniques and high-resolution scanning, she was able to bring out details in the mysterious background figure that had been invisible to the naked eye. Margaret sat beside her, along with David and Father Mackenzie, who had driven down from Millbrook to see the results of their investigation. The enhancement process can reveal details that were captured by the camera but lost over time due to aging and fading, Sarah explained as she adjusted the computer settings. What we're seeing here is essentially a digital version of what a person in 1931 might have seen if they had looked very carefully at the original photograph under perfect lighting conditions. As the image became clearer on the computer screen, the background figure emerged with startling clarity. It was definitely a young man, approximately the same age as the other adults in the photograph. He was partially hidden behind a large oak tree, wearing what appeared to be work clothes, a dark jacket and cap, typical of railroad workers. His face, though still somewhat shadowed, showed the same strong family resemblance that Margaret had inherited from her grandmother's side of the family. It's him, Margaret whispered, tears forming in her eyes. It's Uncle Robert. But there was more. Sarah's digital enhancement revealed something else that had been completely invisible in the original photograph. The young man was holding something in his hands. Sarah adjusted the contrast and brightness, bringing the object into focus. It appeared to be an envelope, thick with what looked like papers or money. "Look at his expression," Father Mackenzie observed quietly. "He's not just hiding. He's watching his family with such love and sadness. And that envelope. Could it be the money he was planning to leave for them?" David leaned forward, studying the enhanced image on the screen. The family portrait was taken on October 15th, according to grandmother's diary. The newspaper said the anonymous donation that saved their farm happened in December. This photograph might have captured the exact moment Robert was deciding whether to reveal himself to his family or continue helping them from the shadows. Sarah printed out the enhanced image and placed it beside the original photograph. The contrast was remarkable. What had been merely a ghostly suggestion in the old photo was now clearly a young man caught between love and shame, unable to join his family but unwilling to abandon them completely. "There's something else," Sarah said, pointing to another area of the enhanced image. "Look at the window of the house. There's a reflection there that wasn't visible before." The reflection in the window that Sarah had spotted proved to be the final piece of the puzzle. When enhanced and magnified, it showed the photographer who had taken the family portrait, and standing beside him was another figure, clearly female, who appeared to be directing the photographer's attention toward the tree where Robert was hiding. "Who could that be?" Margaret asked, studying the reflection intently. Father Mackenzie adjusted his glasses and looked more closely at the enhanced image. "Based on the clothing and posture, I'd say it was an older woman, probably in her 50s or 60s. The photographer seems to be following her gestures." David had an idea. "What if we go back to your grandmother's diary? Maybe there's more information about who was present that day." Margaret retrieved the diary and found the entry for October 15th, 1931. She read it aloud more carefully this time. "Had the family portrait taken today for Henry's birthday. The children looked so beautiful. Prayed that Robert would somehow be with us in spirit. Mrs. Patterson from the photography studio was so kind. She seemed to understand what we were going through and kept adjusting the camera to get the perfect shot. She said family photographs should capture not just who's present, but who's in our hearts." "Mrs. Patterson," Sarah repeated thoughtfully. "She wasn't just the photographer. She was directing the shot. And from what we can see in the reflection, she spotted Robert hiding behind the tree. They decided to make one more trip to Millbrook, this time to investigate the Patterson photography studio. The building still stood on Main Street, though it had been converted to an antique shop years earlier. The current owner, Jerry Patterson, was the grandson of the original photographer, Mrs. Eleanor Patterson. "My grandmother ran that studio from 1925 to 1955, Jerry explained as he led them through the shop to a back room where he stored old photography equipment and records. She was known for her compassionate approach to family portraits, especially during the Depression when so many families were dealing with loss and separation. He pulled out a dusty box marked 1931 client records and began searching through the files. Here it is. Henderson family portrait, October 15th, 1931. But look at this. There's a note in my grandmother's handwriting. The note, written in careful script, read, "Young man observed watching family from distance during portrait session. Appeared to be family member. Adjusted camera angle and lighting to include him in background without family's knowledge. Sometimes the camera sees what the heart knows, but the mind cannot accept. Final payment received anonymously 1 week later with note. Thank you for including everyone who belongs." Margaret began to cry softly. She knew. The photographer knew Robert was there, and she made sure he was part of the family portrait, even though he couldn't bring himself to join them. And he paid for the photograph, David added, looking at the notation about the anonymous payment. Even from the shadows, he was still taking care of his family. The revelation about Mrs. Patterson's compassionate act led Sarah and Margaret to make one final discovery that would complete Robert Henderson's story. Jerry Patterson had mentioned that his grandmother had kept detailed notes about many of her clients, particularly during the difficult Depression years. when photography was often a family's last luxury before losing everything. In Mrs. Patterson's personal journal, which Jerry had preserved in the back room of the antique shop, they found several entries about the Henderson family. The entry, dated October 22, 1931, 1 week after the portrait session, was particularly revealing. The young Henderson boy came to the studio after midnight tonight. He paid for his family's portrait and asked me to make extra copies, one for each family member and one for himself. He said he was leaving town soon and wanted to carry their faces with him wherever he went. I've never seen such pain in someone so young. He made me promise never to tell his family he had been there, but asked me to make sure they knew they were loved. I gave him the extra prints and told him that love like his never truly disappears. It becomes part of the people we leave behind. But the most touching entry came a few weeks later, dated November 30th, 1931. Received a letter from Robert Henderson today, postmarked from California. He has found work in the orange groves outside Los Angeles and is slowly saving money to send back home. He asked me to watch over his family and to take their portrait again next year if they can afford it. I want to see how much the children have grown, he wrote. Even from far away, I want to witness their lives. I wrote back to tell him that his love is already witnessing their lives. It's there in that photograph, captured forever. Margaret was quiet for a long time after hearing this. Finally, she spoke softly. My grandmother used to say that some people love so deeply they're willing to disappear to protect what they love. I never understood what she meant until now. Sarah studied the enhanced photograph again, seeing it now with complete understanding. Robert Henderson wasn't just hiding in the background of his family's portrait. He was choosing to be present in the only way he felt he could, ensuring his love would be captured and preserved even as he prepared to sacrifice his own place in their daily lives. Did he ever come back? Sarah asked gently. Margaret shook her head. Not as far as we know, but for the next 20 years. Until both my great-grandparents died, anonymous gifts would arrive at Christmas. Money, food, sometimes photographs of orange groves in California. My grandmother always said it was Uncle Robert, making sure his family was cared for even though he could never come home. Word of the discovered family portrait and Robert Henderson's hidden story began to spread throughout Millbrook and the surrounding communities. Local newspaper editor Susan Martinez heard about the investigation and published a feature article about the photograph, which was picked up by larger newspapers across Illinois and eventually reached social media, where it touched thousands of people who shared their own stories of family separation and hidden love during difficult times. The response was overwhelming. Sarah's studio began receiving calls from families across the Midwest who had old photographs they wanted examined for hidden details. Margaret found herself fielding dozens of messages from relatives she had never met, distant cousins and descendants of the Henderson family who had their own stories and photographs to share. Most remarkably, 3 weeks after the newspaper article was published, Margaret received a phone call that would change everything. The caller was Patricia Henderson Morales, a 67-year-old retired teacher from Los Angeles, who claimed to be Robert Henderson's daughter. I saw the article online, Patricia explained when she called. My father never talked much about his early life, but he kept that same family photograph on his dresser until the day he died in 1987. He used to tell me it was the most important picture ever taken because it proved that love could be present even when it couldn't be seen. Patricia had grown up knowing that her father had left his family in Illinois during the Depression, but had never known the full story. He worked in the orange groves for several years, then started his own small construction business. He married my mother in 1940, and they had a good life together, but every Christmas he would send money back to Illinois. He never explained why, just said there were people who needed to know they weren't forgotten. She had driven up from Los Angeles with a box of her father's belongings, including letters, photographs, and documents that filled in the missing pieces of Robert's life. Among them was a letter he had written to her shortly before his death, to be opened only if someone ever came looking for information about his early life. In the letter, Robert had explained his decision to leave Illinois and his lifelong regret. about not being able to repair the relationship with his family. But he also wrote about the peace he had found in knowing that his love had been captured in that 1931 photograph, invisible to his family at the time, but always present, always watching over them. "I have carried their faces with me every day for 56 years, he wrote to his daughter, "and someday, someone will discover that love can be hidden but never truly lost. When that day comes, I hope my family will understand that leaving them was the hardest thing I ever did, and loving them was the easiest." Margaret and Patricia met for the first time in Sarah's studio, two women separated by geography and generation, but connected by the invisible threads of family love that had persisted across decades. They stood together, looking at the enhanced photograph that had revealed Robert's presence, and Margaret finally understood what her grandmother had meant all those years when she said, "Never forget." 6 months later, on a warm spring day in Millbrook, 4 generations of the Henderson family gathered at the same house where the 1931 photograph had been taken. The house, now owned by distant relatives, still stood on Elm Street, though it had been renovated and expanded over the decades. Margaret Williams, now 79, sat in a lawn chair on the front steps, surrounded by more than 30 family members who had traveled from across the country for this reunion. Sarah Chen had driven up from Chicago with a specially prepared presentation that included not only the original and enhanced versions of the 1931 photograph, but also dozens of other family pictures that various relatives had contributed. Using her digital restoration skills, she had created a comprehensive family timeline that showed how Robert's descendants in California had paralleled the lives of his siblings' families in Illinois, 2 branches of the same tree growing in different soil but sharing the same roots. Patricia Henderson Morales had brought her own family, children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren who were meeting their Illinois cousins for the first time. The reunion had taken months to organize, with family members driving and flying in from California, Texas, Michigan, and even as far away as Maine, where one branch of the family had eventually settled. Father Mackenzie offered a blessing over the assembled family, saying a prayer for Robert Henderson and all the family members who had passed away over the decades. "Love," he said, "has a way of revealing itself when we most need to see it. This photograph reminds us that we are never truly alone, even in our darkest moments." David Williams, Margaret's nephew who had helped with the original investigation, had spent the past several months researching and writing a book about the discovery of the hidden figure in the 1931 photograph. The book, titled "Never Forget, A Family's Hidden Love Story," would be published that fall, with all proceeds going to a scholarship fund for students studying photography and historical preservation. As the reunion continued into the evening, with stories shared and new relationships formed, Margaret found herself standing in almost the exact spot where her great-grandmother Rose had stood for that long-ago portrait. She held the original 1931 photograph in her hands, no longer seeing it as just an old family picture, but as proof that love persists even when it cannot be spoken, even when it must remain hidden, even when it requires the ultimate sacrifice of separation. The last light of day was filtering through the same oak tree where Robert Henderson had hidden nearly a century earlier, and Margaret could almost feel his presence, not as a ghost or supernatural visitation, but as the enduring power of love that transcends time, distance, and even death itself. In the background of every family photograph, she now understood, are the invisible faces of all those who love us, watching over us, ensuring that we are never truly alone. As the family prepared to take a new group photograph on the front steps, Margaret whispered a quiet "thank you" to her Uncle Robert, knowing that somewhere in the background of this new picture, his love would be present too. Invisible perhaps, but never forgotten.